laying somewhere, and a lot better off in your hands. They may still be a couple more back on the back. It's also amazing to me how many we get, and every time I think, well, that's way more than we need, but they seem to disappear. I don't know if we eat them or what we do.
I got one more if you need it.
You got one more? Okay, anybody else need one? Good? Okay, John's got one if you need one. In fact, I'm glad you said that, because as John was reading there a minute ago from Psalm 4, it said, though I have stolen nothing, I still must restore it. Did you study that, John? You know what he's talking about?
Psalm 4, or Psalm 69.
Psalm 69, verse 4.
Oh, verse 4.
Though I've stolen nothing, I still must restore it. Anybody notice that? Anybody know what that means? I don't either. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. My thoughts are that, that's not a bad thought if we are ever tempted to do something or to take something or to maybe say something ugly. What we really should do, instead of saying something ugly, is say something nice. Or instead of taking something, use that as a reason to give. I don't know if that's what he has in mind or not, but it just sort of caught my attention in that reading, and I thought, well, that's, I'll have to go back and look at that, or if you do, let me know what you come up with.
He said he was going to restore it. He might have just been doing that out of good faith, good conscience.
Could have been. And I thought, maybe he has been accused of something. He didn't do anything, but he's going to restore it even though it's not true. It's sort of like maybe sometimes apologizing, although you're not the one that needs to apologize. You ever done that? I hope you have, because that happens sometimes, and you think, well, it's not me. Well, no, it's not me, but if I can do something to rectify the issue, in Matthew 5, Jesus speaks of going the second mile. You go the first mile because that's your duty, your responsibility. We're commanded to do that. But that second mile of maybe doing above board, to be nice or to be courteous or to help or to give, that's really where Christianity starts coming in. What is it Jesus said? If we only do that which is commanded, that's duty. It's duty. It's duty. And in fact, it touches a little bit on where he talks about love. If we only love those that love us, he says we're not any different than the publicans and the sinners, right? Because they love people that love them. The Christian challenge is to love those that don't love us.
If you restore something that you do not owe, you cannot be held in blame. Nobody can blame you.
So we went above and beyond.
But I think the Lord in the spiritual term, he recognizes that even though he's trying to live righteously and doing what he's supposed to be doing, he still understands that he's in debt. He's in debt to the blessings of the Lord gives us each and every day. And sometimes we think that we're in an exchange basis. And sometimes I catch myself thinking it's an exchange. He gives me because I give to him. And that is not what that's not what we should recognize. We should recognize he gives us more than we could ever exchange with him. And therefore we would need to greet his debt regardless of what blessings we think or good things we think we do.
Yeah.
Considering what he's done for us.
I agree. I think we do sometimes fall into that, Christ died for me, so I need, well, yes I do, but I'll always be in debt, and there's no way of it being a 50-50 deal, obviously. what He's done for us, we cannot do for ourselves. And, the old adage, you can't, earn your salvation, and you really can. Now, we realize that sometimes that has been taken too far. We're saved by grace and nothing that we do. That is not true. We're saved by grace through faith. And the faith, as it is used there, entails, in fact, faith always entails obedience. If you look at biblical faith, it's never without obedience. It is never just believing something. It's always believing which prompts us to do something, to respond in some way. So,
Especially John.
yeah, especially that. Yes.
On the reference there, Bible, that's John 15:25, says, "But this happened, that the word might be fulfilled, which is written in their law. They hated me without a cause."
Hated without cause. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes we might, reverse that or consider it. We sometimes need to love without a cause. You love knowing you're not going to be loved back. And sometimes a person is probably going to be accused or mistreated without a cause. You didn't do anything wrong, and yet we're still commanded to love one another. And Alan made a good point a couple of weeks ago. Don't mean you have to like me, but you have to love me. If you don't go to heaven, that is. And sometimes we don't. Our personalities clash so much. And you can't do that. You cannot really like a person in their ways and their attitudes, but you love them in the sense of treating them correctly. Jim, then I'll get back to you, John.
We're told to love our enemies, do good to them who despitefully use us, and all these other things that we're reminded of. And that all goes back to, Jesus loved us enough to die for us. What would we ever repay for that?
Yep.
That we can't pay.
Oh, and we'll never repay it. But that's not the point. And some people say, well, I can't repay it, so why try? Well, that's where obedience comes in. It's not to repay it, but it is out of respect and out of love and out of a gratitude for something that we couldn't do for ourselves, that we become obedient. John?
I think if I heard Jim right, he said, love your enemies. That's kind of what I was going to say, but add to that this guy is being an example and trying to evangelize the other people and show them what we should be like,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and that's Matthew 5, 44, 45, somewhere there. Bless those that would curse you. Do good to them that would abuse you. Love those that would mistreat you. And again, Jesus goes on to say that, I'll use paraphrase, what's the big deal if I'm good to you because you're really good to me? I need that, but yeah, we should. The real Christianity shines through when, you're good to me, although I'm not always good to you. And that is the real challenge for us, and that's what Jesus is getting at. And I think that in that same context, I think it's verse 41 or 42, he gets into that idea, and in that same context, the idea of going the second mile in our religion, and it goes back to the Roman government's law that if a Roman official or a soldier asks you to carry a burden or do something, then you were by law required to go a mile. In fact, they would sometimes measure off. The Jews would, from their house down the road to a mile, and put a stake in there. and they would not go a step further than that stake. So when Jesus taught that, he was aware of that rule, and the people he was talking to were aware of that rule. And so he's challenging them to go 2 miles, which you can imagine if a Roman soldier made you carry his weapons and whatever for a mile, and you just walk right on by the stake, and he sees it, and you see it, and you're just trucking it right on down the road. That would make a real impression. And as John prayed in his prayer a minute ago, help us to have a good influence on those that we come in contact with, and to be a good influence on those that the person you come in contact with tells somebody else, and thus that reputation goes on. But I digress here. We are on lesson 9. We are talking here about Nathaniel this morning, as we've been looking at these different personalities. But I guess I'll digress again. There's so much in the Bible when you start digging into it. And when I asked that question there from Psalm 69, then it led to your thoughts and your questions and your comments. And it's amazing how much you can dig out of a lesson or a thought that maybe at first glance you don't think there's anything there. And Rick and I were talking about this particular lesson this morning on Nathaniel. I had to do a lot of digging to come up with what I thought would be a good course and challenging course. And so in your study, I would appreciate your thoughts as to what you gained out of the study of this individual. What you probably, no doubt, noticed is that the Bible does not say much about Nathaniel. What it does say is pretty important. But his name only occurs in John's Gospel. You don't have his name mentioned in Matthew and Mark and Luke. In their accounts, talking about the disciples or the 12, the apostles, of which Nathaniel was one, you have the name Bartholomew. And if you research that, most that I read, and there's some reasons for it. Part of it is because of the association with Philip, the order, and the fact that Nathaniel was one of the disciples, and yet he's not there, but Bartholomew is, and he makes 12. So it's thought that likely that was his other name. Who else had another name? Peter did. Paul did. Saul, Paul, Peter. On and on you go. Barnabas was Joseph. You remember when they were looking for another apostle, they had Joseph or Justus, and then Matthias. So, first person. A lot of them had a Greek name, they had a Roman name, sometimes they had a Hebrew name, depending on circumstances. And one of the things that you might noted that many times the name maybe wasn't even mentioned, but it was son of. And Jesus, you remember, is even described as the son of Joseph. And that was pretty common. But Bartholomew's name follows Philip in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in their list of the apostles. And we talked talk about this a little bit more, but Philip is the one that went and found Nathanael, so that gives a little more credence to that. Now, Bartholomew is really not a personal name, but it's a name derived from a father or ancestor. And basically, Bartholomew means a son of Tolmai, T-O-L-M-A-I. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it maybe as you might pronounce it, but that it is the idea. So, surely Bartholomew had another name because his name meant the son of Tolmai. We would guess that it is Nathanael. No reason not to think of that. Nathanael is one of the earliest disciples, and we're looking at John 1, and then we're going to the end of John 21, in the two texts that are in our lesson today. So Nathanael is one of the earliest, but it's also there after the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. And if I remember correctly, in John 21, where Jesus is on the shore, the disciples have decided to go fishing, and Jesus appears to them. I think that was the last appearance there, except when you get over to Acts chapter 1, and Jesus is ready to ascend back to heaven. And it's interesting that not all of the apostles were there. I think there were 7 of them, but Nathanael was one of those. So he began early, but he was there, and he continued throughout. Also, in the statement that Nathanael made when Jesus showed him who it was, he recognized Jesus as king, and he was one of the first to make the scriptural association. He evidently was very, very well versed in the Old Testament scriptures, and the same thing would have been said true of Philip. When he said, what we've been looking for. And I think that was pretty similar to what Andrew said, wasn't it? When Andrew, met Jesus and he went to get Peter, and he also gave an indication there that, this is him. This is the Son of God. This is the one that we've been looking for. And, we talked about this. I don't know if it's my lesson or I believe it was in Rick's lesson a little bit more, where we talked about the lack of education and formal education. The Apostle Paul, and he was much later, seems to have been the only one that had, more of a formal education as he studied under Gamaliel in Jerusalem. But that was pretty expensive. You remember Paul later, was from Tarsus. So quite a distance, but the family evidently had enough money to support. It was like sending one of your kids off to college. It's always been expensive, I guess. But these fishermen, although, and Rick made this point, and something I hadn't thought of too much either, it says that James and John, when they left their father Zebedee, they left him with the servants. So they evidently were not the poorest of people. They were hard-working people to fish and to take care of nets and boats and all that type of thing. Would not have been an easy occupation, but a lack of education. But I say all that to say that they knew the scriptures. So when we say they were not educated, more likely more of a formal thing above and beyond. But these Jewish boys were taught the scriptures. The scriptures were read in the temple and the synagogues. A lot of emphasis was put on memorization, and no doubt the parents had done that. And so, with bedtime stories and stories throughout the day, you remember in Deuteronomy chapter 6, where Moses is talking about the importance of teaching their families. And you remember he talks about doing it when you rise up in the morning, doing it when you go to bed at night. So Moses was letting them know how important it was that the families, the parents, and really that's where the responsibility lies. If we're depending on the preacher, we're depending on the Sunday school teachers, we're missing the boat. We need that. We obviously need to be here to worship, to be taught, to be reminded. But if our kids and our grandkids are only getting it here, they're not getting it. Not to the degree that they need. And I might have mentioned this, I think I did. My class at Bible Camp this year was one of the neatest classes I've ever had in 40 years of teaching class. But these kids were 10 years old, and it turned out the smallest class I've ever had 5 girls and 1 boy. But it was unbelievable how sharp that little boy was. Immediately, you knew this boy has been taught the Bible at home. You could mention a passage, and he wouldn't necessarily quote it, but he could tell you what it said. You could ask him almost any kind of a biblical question, and he didn't just give one-word answers. He would elaborate. And we were talking about heaven and hell and the rich man and Lazarus. I know I told you this, but I guess I'll tell it a lot. And I'm getting older, so you have to excuse me, right? I'm going to tell the same stories again and again. That's one good thing about getting older. You can do that and get away with it, supposedly. Either we get away with it or we just don't remember that we told it, so it doesn't matter anyway. But this little boy was talking about the gulf between the rich man and Lazarus, when the rich man lifted up his eyes in torment, and Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom. And he commented on that, and he said, that they could see each other, they could hear each other. He said, wonder how big that gulf was. And he just went on, like I do sometimes too. I talk to myself, as you wonder things. And so we're sitting there in class, and the boy's sort of talking to himself. So he was, for a 10-year-old, to me, it was amazing how he was thinking in depth. But it was obvious right from the beginning that he had been taught. And I think we see that in Nathaniel. We see that in Philip particularly, as well as in Andrew. And they were not the main characters, as we would think about it, because, as we mentioned, what we see here about Nathaniel, that's about it. Anybody with a thought or comment further there? Okay, as we get into the questions, we're on page 88. One point of interest I thought, and you may have backed up a little bit and looked at this as well, but Jesus had been in Bethany, and then beyond the Jordan. Bethany was just a short distance outside of Jerusalem. John the Baptist had been on the Jordan or beyond Jordan where there was enough water for people to be baptized. But if you back up there in John chapter 1, about verse 28 or so, Jesus was beyond the Jordan, and he traveled north all the way up to Galilee. And the Bible doesn't give a reason for that. But that was basically where he began his personal ministry. So Jesus is in Bethany, likely at the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He's beyond the Jordan, and many times the Jews would go to the east of Jordan and travel up the east side of the river to Galilee. And many of them did that because they did not want to go through Samaria. They hated the Samaritans or despised them or put them down so badly. Obviously, that was not the reason for Jesus doing that, because he deliberately went through Samaria on different occasions. But we're at the beginning of the ministry, and Nathanael is one of the first that is selected and invited to follow Jesus. So that gives us a little bit of the context. And as I pointed out, we really don't know why Jesus traveled the way he did. It may have been important for him to begin his personal ministry in Galilee because Peter, James, John, Philip, Andrew, Thomas, Philip, Nathaniel, they were all up there basically from that particular area. Question number 1, who brought Nathanael to Jesus? So it's Philip, wasn't it? We talked about that a little bit. And Andrew got Peter, and Philip got Nathanael. So what is the lesson for us in that? I know a few lessons ago we talked about it when we talked about Peter. But what is the lesson or lessons for us there?
Personal evangelism works.
It works, yep. It works if we work it. It don't just work. You're talking about it will work, right?
It will work if we do it.
What you're saying. Yeah. It will work. It will work if we work it. Does it work in every case? It didn't even work in every case when Jesus did. Not everybody followed him, especially when he stopped feeding them as often or performing as many miracles. It's interesting that Jesus says on one occasion that he didn't turn anybody away, he healed everybody. He didn't always do that. Earlier in his ministry, he did that. He fed the 5,000, fed the 4,000. But you get later, when he began to teach, like the Sermon on the Mount, and to challenge them to change their lives, people haven't changed, have they? As long as there's a handout, as long as it is easy Christianity, as long as we're not asked to make big changes, we listen to that, we're comfortable with that. But when we are really challenged to change and to do differently, Bob and I were talking about that last night. Bob's here been reading from Ezekiel, and that's a fun read. But talking about how strange Ezekiel was, how weird he was, how different he was, and yet he was pleasing to God. When we are what we ought to be and doing what we ought to be doing, just like loving people that don't love us, being good to people that are not good to us, the world will think we're crazy. And yet, that really is where it is at, the true, faithful obedience.
You just say we got to think about, evangelism is kind of like provide something that works for us, so we recommend it to somebody else. Well, we're doing the same thing when we tell somebody about a problem. We got something that works for us. Why not tell other people that?
Well, why not? What's the answer? Why not?
I can't imagine that we're going to spread good news to anybody else.
I agree. And yet, I don't always do it.
There's an implication in evangelism of right and wrong, and that's a challenge for me. There's an implication when you present the gospel to someone or discuss the church. It's a given that you are taking a position maybe that they need to examine where they are because of the expected outcome after their death, based on Scripture. And that's a challenge, that's a very difficult bridge to cross without coming off a certain way. And there's a relationship that needs to exist before you do that. I mean, there's an implied meaning to that's life and death.
Yeah, I agree, and I think so. I think the point being, maybe at the very first meeting, you don't want to preach to somebody. On the other hand, there is that danger that the second meeting or the third meeting, and I don't know about you, but I've been guilty of knowing somebody maybe for quite some time, and then I get to thinking, I've not even invited them to church. And maybe I've known them for months, or maybe have known them for years. And Jim asked a good question, why haven't I said anything? Well, I think that we can sadly get into a rut, so to speak. Now, and Tom brings up a good point also, I think, or going in that direction is, there's a way to invite, and a way not to invite. That there is a place. Maybe in a crowd, it's not a good idea. At certain activities, maybe not. But we do need to find a place and time and a way to at least say what Philip said, and what did basically Andrew say, Teacher Philip, come and see. Come and see. And Nathaniel, although he was a little skeptical there, especially when Philip mentioned Jesus of Nazareth, he was willing to come and see. And so that's really what it is all about, is to try to invite people to think that they're just going to accept church, and they're just going to accept God, and they're just going to accept Jesus without evidence. That's just not going to work. Even if they do, it's probably very, very shallow. People have to learn and to know. And so, back to kind of where we started, we need to invite, we need to encourage. Discipleship, really, that's a foundation of it, is we become a disciple in order to make disciples. We become a follower, a learner, in order to lead others.
We got to plant the seed.
You have to plant the seed, and I think that is the challenge, is that we have not done that, not to the degree that we should be doing. Yes, ma'am.
Steve, I think one of the things that is the most troublesome to us is that we want to judge everybody.
Yeah.
We know their background, we know that they may be in a marriage that's not
Right.
sexual. We know that, you know, and we want to say, oh, we've never changed from that. And I think, we have hindrances like that because we just look at them and what we know about them, and then we judge as to whether or not they will receive Christ. And that's just not
Yeah.
The worst part of it,
Yeah.
when we do that, we come across this whole thing.
Yeah.
That we understand that we're sharing something that we need more than something we have.
Yeah.
We have to recognize that we are always in need of Christ. And we're not better than other people because we come to the realization that we need Christ.
Yeah, and,
I come to church not because I'm holy. I come to church because I need Christ.
yeah,
And we've got to understand if that's our attitude, then we're telling people they need what we need.
yep.
And we're going to give them that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, and Ruth's exactly right, and you're exactly right. And I think that's what's interesting in that little expression, come and see. Philip or Andrew, neither one didn't to their friend or their brother. They said, come and see. Okay, next week it is Nicodemus.